Harper recently told business leaders in Ottawa that his government is, quote, extremely pro-American. His comments about the relationship between the U.S. and Canada are a little less than an hour.
Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue, monsieur.
Merci beaucoup.
Premier Ministre. Unfortunately, that's it for my French.
Oh,
it's not it for your French.
You've done well, jusqu'à maintenant.
Merci. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank all of you. This is great. It's an honor to have you. It's good to see you again. Let me explain for all of us here how this is going to work, this part of our program. We've been here since 10 o'clock this morning. We've got a pretty packed day. This part might be the highlight, at least for me. But here, just for the benefit of everybody in the room, here's what we're going to do. I've got a few questions that I'd like to ask the Prime Minister. We're going to have a dialogue. And I, by the way, appreciate you doing this format as opposed to kind of a speech with a podium. I think this is more fun. Again, for me.
Well, we appreciate you having us here. It's wonderful.
Great. So I'll ask a few questions. If I can get through my questions, I'll ask you if you've got questions. When we get to that point, I'll acknowledge you. I will ask you to identify yourself, put your question in the form of a question, and maybe ask something that I haven't already asked or he hasn't already answered, just so that we can get through it. We've got about 45 minutes, and then I've got to get back to this, but you've got a busy day. So you need no introduction in this room, but I would like to set context, and then I'll start asking you questions. And the context, I would say, is that Prime Minister Harper has governed during a period in history that is really challenging. It's been challenging economically, it's been challenging from a security point of view, with everything that's happening in the world today. I won't say it's the most challenging period since 1812, a big day, but maybe since World War II, in all seriousness. And during that period, the World Economic Forum declared Canada's banks the soundest in the world. We had Jim Prentice here earlier with CIBC. We have the other banks from Canada here. No Canadian bank failed while we were having our Lehman moment. It's all good up here. Also during the Prime Minister's tenure, Forbes magazine declared Canada as the best place on earth to do business. So that's pretty good. And in the Canadian American Business Council, we agree with that. So let me get to the first question, if I can. Mr. Prime Minister, some observers from Canada who are seen to have insight into your thinking have opined recently publicly that somehow in the last 4 years, Obama, quote, lost Canada. There are some of us on the southern side of the border who might disagree with that, but I thought this is your opportunity to set the record straight. What is the state of the relationship and how's it going?
Well, I would completely disagree with that. You know, I've always said, I said when I was in opposition, I say as I'm Prime Minister, our most important relationship as Canadians is with the United States of America. We are, one of the many blessings this country has is its neighborhood, where, you know, I was just talking to Prime Minister Netanyahu the other day. They talk about a difference in a neighborhood. As he likes,
something going on in this neighborhood?
Yeah, as he likes to point out, we have 3 oceans on 3 sides, and we have the United States of America on the other side, which is the best neighbor in the world you could possibly have. So we're very fortunate. And I've always viewed that it's the responsibility of the Government of Canada to have as good a relationship as we can have, while obviously protecting our interests with the United States. And I think our government has had good relations with 2 successive and very different American administrations. With President Obama, we really are now embarked on an unprecedented exercise, the Beyond the Border Initiative, and also the Regulatory Cooperation Council, an unprecedented effort at further integration and thinning of the border. I think this is very important, beneficial for both countries. You know, President Obama and I, obviously we don't agree on everything, but these countries share so much in common. We share not just an economy and wider value system, we also share security needs, and unfortunately we share security threats. So when you have a relationship that's close, in my judgment, it can't help but be good, and it's been a good relationship, and I look forward to 4 more years of working with President Obama.
Outstanding. Thank you for that. You just returned from Asia.
Yeah.
Your team's a little jet-lagged. You're not? That's good.
I'm a little jet lagged too.
Okay.
It's not showing it as much.
Excellent. President Obama's in Asia. His first trip when he was elected, the first time was here to Ottawa. His first trip in his re-election is to Asia. Clearly both of you view Asia as enormously important, and clearly both of you are committed to enhancing free trade. I think I read or heard you're looking at 50 different trade deals or something. But what I wanted to ask you is, when our organization was founded 25 years ago, and this is our 25th anniversary, we were founded largely to be a proponent of free trade, because the notion was there aren't enough voices on either side of the border that are pointing out the benefits. There are only naysayers. So that's why we started. In those 25 years, my own observation is that Canadians are relatively more open to free trade these days than Americans. That there are vestiges of protectionism that reside south of the border. I just wonder what your observations on that are, and maybe what do you attribute that difference to?
Sure, no, that's a great question. First of all, just a correction of the preamble. We are in negotiations on trade agreements with over 50 countries. They aren't 50 separate negotiations. One of the big ones is with the European Union.
Okay.
Obviously, TPP is another big one, but we're in the later stages of the European Union negotiations, and that's 27 countries right there. Look, there's been a tremendous shift in this country in so many ways since I got involved in politics in the mid-1980s. And one of the real big shifts has been the attitude of the Canadian people towards trade and protectionism. It's probably true. I mean, I can't remember the numbers, but it's probably true that Canadians were instinctively more protectionist in their political views back then than Americans were. But look, the big difference, two things have happened. First of all, we signed the historic Canada-United States trade agreement, a previous conservative government. And you know, I know that was an important event in the United States, but it was a much bigger event in this country because, of course, historically, to the extent people worried about trade and people were protectionists, that was often driven by non-economic issues and by fear of assimilation and fear of loss of sovereignty and all of these things. And of course, those who opposed the trade agreement and did so quite vocally and quite extremely, and predicted not merely disadvantages to the Canadian economy, but predicted the disappearance of Canada as a nation. Having done that and that not having come to pass, they kind of took a bit of a credibility hit on that. And so look, I think that was a turning point. I think Canadians saw, we had a deep trade relationship with the United States before that, but obviously it grew. It hasn't impacted our ability to be independent on policy matters where we actually want to be independent. It's resulted in vast increases in economic opportunity for Canadians and Canadian families. So that's I think the difference. We went through what was, in a sense, a pretty traumatic and cathartic exercise. The Canadian people made a decision. That decision has been validated by history. What you see now in this country, now look, I watch what's happening in the U.S. very closely. And I see, I would agree with you, a surprising amount of protectionism in American political discourse on both sides of the political divide. In this country, it's very different. Protectionist discourse on the right is virtually non-existent. It's interesting what on the left, among our opponents, they rarely now campaign against trade. In fact, they purport to be for it. They just oppose any individual trade deal or any individual example of trade because they know they can't win the broader argument. So, you know, I think, as I say, Canada's made a decision. This is a small, open economy. It's a globally dependent economy, a trade-dependent economy, much more so than the United States, in fact. And so, look, while individual trade decisions or issues can be controversial, the concept of being part of a trading global economy is not seriously challenged here, the way it is surprisingly challenged in the U.S. And I say surprisingly because even though you're less trade dependent, the United States is still the core of the world trading system. So I'm often surprised at the level of protectionist discourse.
Me too, but then again, it's job security for us in Washington at the CABC, so we'll continue fighting that battle. Let me shift gears for a second. you were kind enough to join us for a roundtable. CABC did a roundtable in Chicago. You've done a few for us.
Yeah.
On the margins of the NATO, we went to Chicago.
Right.
And I'll just share with our guests here, you asked a question. You know, of the room, you asked business leaders what the biggest impediment to economic growth and prosperity was from their point of view. And we had lots of different sectors. Several of the people that were in the room there are in the room today. And I thought I would hear the answer that you hear from business leaders all the time, which is we need more transparency, we need more predictability, and by the way, we need more regulatory coherence. That's what I was positive that sort of 8 out of 10 folks would say that. And I'm not sure if you remember this, but what everybody ended up saying, all those things that I mentioned are important to business, both sides of the border, all around the world. But what people said, you asked what the number one thing was. And what everybody came to the agreement about was access to skilled workforce. And so my question to you, and I found that surprising, I don't know if it surprised you, but my question to you is, what are the kinds of things that the private sector and the government can do to build the kind of workforce that our economy is going to require into the future?
Mm-hmm. This is, in fact, I was not surprised by the answer, because this is, in fact, the answer I hear at most business roundtables around the country.
Yeah.
There are obviously regional differences. In some parts of Western Canada, it's a much more acute concern than elsewhere. But this is, in fact, in my judgment, the biggest challenge our country faces going forward. There are a lot of them out there. But the big one is the shortage of labor in key areas. And even with, you know, the tail end of the recession and the slow recovery, this problem continues to manifest itself. It was getting acute before the big crash, and it's coming back quite quickly. And it's coming for a couple of reasons. One of them is demographic. There's a long-term demographic shift towards the aging of our population in our country, as in all developed countries.
Sucks to get old.
That's right. But on top of that, we have I think we have the reality that for whatever reason, and I think the causes are social and cultural and hard to explain, for whatever reason, we know that people's choices in terms of the education system tend to lead us to what appears to be a chronic shortage of certain skills. They are skilled trades, scientists, and engineers. And it's just consistent and it's persistent. What we're trying to do as a government are several things. We're trying to improve our labor markets. We're making certain investments, particularly to get people to be aware of opportunities in the skilled trades, to complete some of that training. We're readjusting our immigration programs so that our immigration programs are going to be more active. I mean, traditionally, we're per capita the largest immigrant receiver in the world, but traditionally we have extremely passive immigration intake. We accept applications. We're trying to change that so that we start to identify the needs we have, and we go out and we find those needs in the world. And we're going to have to do that because we're finding whereas in the past we used to be one of the few immigrant accepting countries, we're increasingly in competition for skilled immigration. So those are some of the things we're doing. Obviously, we need other levels of government doing some of those things as well, because in Canada the provinces are the ones principally responsible for the labor market. And look, we're always open to whatever we can do with business, in partnership with business or other levels of government, to address this problem. But I think it is going to be a persistent challenge.
Yeah, agreed. Cisco talked to us about the training that they do, the Cisco Academy around the United States and Canada. It's fascinating. Staying on the subject of skilled workers, though, TransCanada has said that they could hire every engineering student in Canada next year, and they still wouldn't have enough people for their approved projects, which reminds me of the subject of the Keystone Project. It's squarely in the hands of Nebraska. I think they'll come to a conclusion next month. Then it goes back to the administration. Nebraska was the only one remaining hiccup after all of that. So what I want to ask you about, obviously it's in the U.S. government hands, but what I want to ask you is, does it concern you that for Canadian oil and energy generally, that the IEA is now saying, as recently as last week, that the United States is going to be able to meet its own oil and gas needs in a decade? do you worry about KX? You can say what you want about KXL, but do you worry more generally about markets for Canadian energy?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, just briefly on Keystone, I think everybody knows our view on Keystone. I think it's not just a great economic and energy project, but it's a great security project. There's makes a lot more sense, in my judgment, to be bringing North American oil into the United States than Venezuelan or Far Eastern or Middle Eastern oil. So I think it's just obvious. There's a process in the United States. The president has told me he's going to let the process play out, and he hasn't made a decision one way or another, and I accept him at his word on that. But as I've said, in the context of Keystone, I think it's in a way been a bit of an opportunity for this country to understand that we actually do need to sell our energy products outside the United States. Canada is the most energy abundant country in the world. I tell people, whatever the energy sources are of the future, Canada will be a significant supplier. It makes no sense in a global economy, that we're in, for Canada to sell all of its energy products virtually exclusively to its own market or to the United States. 99% of all energy sales simply makes no sense when all the other opportunities are out there. And so I think that, energy, certainly people in the energy business are hearing that message and understand they do have to look for those other opportunities.
Absolutely. Speaking of pipelines, an interesting thing happened several days ago. In the wake of Hurricane Sandy, Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey, one of my favorite characters, by the way, and might run for president someday, you never know. But the governor asked for help with gas pipeline crews. And Spectra Energy, I think there's some people from Spectra here today, but Spectra has crews in Ontario, Union Gas and all that were ready to go. Qualified Canadian gas pipeline workers. And lo and behold, there's some hiccup in PHMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Safety Materials Administration, that says we don't recognize your qualifications. So I get an urgent call from one of our board members, Julie Dill, in Houston, that says, this is crazy. And I said, yeah. So we got into it, and not just me, but several people worked on it, and PHMSA waived the requirement. And then only to find out that there was some lawyer in Ottawa who said, oh, but we couldn't possibly subject Canadian workers to U.S. regs. So anyway, it all got resolved. The crews went and helped the electricity workers go back and forth fairly seamlessly. We just sort of found through this crisis that the gas pipeline workers, there's a hiccup. So to me, it underscored the importance of the beyond the border work that you mentioned. And I'm just wondering if, now that we've got the U.S. elections behind us, you don't have an election anytime soon, is there a moment to breathe life into that agreement to build momentum on it now? And kind of an obvious question, but why was it so important to you? Because you pushed the president pretty hard to get that deal. So.
Well, look, I think it's of immense benefit to both sides. We remain, it's not just the Canadian side, we remain each other's largest trading partners, and we certainly are the two most integrated economies in the world. And to have businesses and others constantly coming up against what are in effect very often silly differences, or what some people say the tyranny of small differences in these kinds of decisions, simply makes no sense. I think we've been making good progress since we agreed to this a year ago. I think it's been moving ahead well. I anticipate that it will pick up some steam now that the election is over. And look, I hope that incidents like this, that both our governments will use the opportunity that instances like this provide us in terms of making change. I know that, back in 08, 09, when everybody had the tremendous financial crisis and the collapsing of economic output, we steamed ahead in Canada with our so-called stimulus program, our economic action plan, in which we identified literally thousands of projects we wanted to go ahead with. And because we wanted to do it quickly, we decided to do a bunch of shortcuts around a bunch of regulatory processes. Decided to take a little bit of a risk. We found that in 99.9% of cases, it made no difference that we made the shortcut. So it proved to us we could actually eliminate some of this redundant regulation and find smoother processes just within the country. So I would hope that, I think there's nothing like an emergency to tell you whether a process is really necessary or not.
Absolutely. There's another thing that's been important to you that I want to ask about, again, now that the election is behind us, and that's the Detroit Bridge. So the ballot measure that would have required a constitutional amendment and all that failed. So my question to you, Mr. Prime Minister, is why was it important enough to Canada that not only did you agree to pay your share, but you agreed to pay our share?
Well, this is, in terms of individual projects between Canada and the United States, I say it's the biggest economic relationship in the world, and there is no single project in that relationship bigger or more important. The Detroit-Windsor crossing is the largest border crossing in the world in terms of economic flows. Right now, as you know, it is under a virtual monopoly situation of a private provider, and we anticipate that in the not too distant future that this is going to be an increasingly serious bottleneck to growth and trade between our countries. So, in our judgment, it makes sense to get on and get this done as soon as we can, so we don't reach a situation in the next few years that could have serious negative impacts upon Canadian and American trade. On the U.S. side, everybody wants it.
Right.
We're not pushing uphill here. The governor wants it. He's been a great supporter of it, helped win that referendum. The business community wants it. The labor unions want it. I was with Governor Snyder, and he had a meeting of all the stakeholders in Michigan who were on side with the bridge, and it was everybody in Michigan. And I understand the American political process is more complex and difficult, but we felt in this case, given the support on the other side and given everybody wants it done, let's just get it done. The best way for that to happen, because of the complexities of your system, was for us to pay for most of it, both sides of it, and to then we'll be getting all that back in the tolls from both sides. And obviously there'll be a joint governance structure over that, but otherwise, we are facing a very uncertain future for that project. So I just felt, I think we all felt, that this is the way to get it done, and I'm very pleased that the governor is, within the constraints that he has done everything on his side to make it happen.
Me too. Speaking of foreign investment, we can't gather today without me asking you a couple of questions about foreign investment that we heard from Bruce March earlier at lunch today.
You've already been warned on this, so
I have no idea what you're talking about. A lot of American multinational companies and other multinational companies, publicly traded companies, invest in the Canadian energy sector. There are some state-owned enterprises that are interested in getting in the game. I wonder, sir, if you could talk a little bit about, is there a difference in your mind between a publicly traded company investing in a state-owned enterprise, and just kind of what your views are on that?
Well, first of all, I think it's necessary to point out that the Canadian economy, except for particular sectors, is actually generally one of the most open economies of the world in terms of foreign investment. We do, however, have a process whereby investments over a certain amount, a threshold that we're raising, by the way, that those do have to be screened to ensure that they're in the net benefit of the Canadian economy. And obviously, we have a global economy and an investment marketplace that is changing very rapidly. As a consequence of this, this government has made some changes to the Investment Canada Act since it took office. We have done a couple of things. We've put a rigorous national security test. We didn't actually have one before. We've put a rigorous national security test in the Investment Canada Act. We've given the government more latitude in terms of communicating with the public on certain matters. But one of the things we did do is we created guidelines specifically for state-owned enterprise, because yes, state-owned enterprise represents a different kind of player. And And obviously, those are some of the issues that are before us today, and beyond that.
You're not making any announcements
beyond that,
today?
I'm not planning to make any announcements today.
I understand. I now understand why journalists are constantly trying to make news. I sort of get it now. Fair enough. One of the things that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will deal with is the question of state-owned enterprises. Ambassador David Jacobson, U.S. Ambassador to Canada, said this morning here that he also thinks that the TPP would be a good way to kind of modernize NAFTA. The question I have for you on all this is, was it enough in your view for Canada to get to the table? Because I think we're in round 14 of the TPP rounds. Or is it really important to actually conclude the talks? I mean, Doha now is synonymous for not getting anything done. Right. So do you think TPP can get done? Or is it enough to just be kind of at the table talking?
Well, for Canada, it was important to be at the table because,
but is it enough?
Obviously, the United States is our biggest trade partner. We already have a trade agreement with the United States, and we have trade agreements with a couple of other of the TPP members, and we have negotiations ongoing with some of them. So look, we don't want to be in a situation ever in the trade world where we become the spokes in what I call a hub and spokes arrangement. We obviously always want to be central in the network of global trade agreements. And look, I think that the fact we got to the table and Mexico has come to the table, while there are always challenges, I think that overall this will be to the benefit of both Canada and the United States. I think that particularly Canada and the United States are far more likely to share perspectives on a very wide range of issues, not all issues, but a very wide range of issues, than the United States is going to find it's ultimately going to be sharing with some of the other players at the table. Look, the reality of this negotiation is that I'd say two things about multilateral trade negotiations that I've been involved in. One is that, look, we're always intrigued and excited to be part of a multilateral process. But I would say that the more partners in a process, the tougher getting a deal is. Yeah. And unfortunately, in some kinds of processes that we've been involved in, and I would not put the European Union one in this category, it's a little different. But generally speaking, unfortunately, often in a multilateral process, the nature of the debate is driven by the least ambitious member around the table. And so that's a risk. But as I say, we're pleased to be there. I think it's got, as I say, some of our critical existing trading partners. But there's a lot of work to be done, in my judgment, to get this thing to the finish line, let alone over it.
Me too. I want to shift gears completely. You and I are both hockey fans. You might be a bigger hockey fan than I am. But we saw each other in Vancouver at the Olympics and at the gold medal round, which had an unfortunate result from my point of view. But congratulations to Canada. So my question, and earlier today, we had both anthems played at lunch, and the comment was made, you don't hear that much anymore. So my question to you is, with NHL not playing, what are you doing with all your spare time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been watching a lot of football.
Who are you cheering? Okay, you're from Toronto, going to Calgary.
We'll get to that in a second. We'll get to that. Let me evade that one for a moment. I also have an interest, as you know, in hockey history. So not all of my interest is just in what happens today. I read and write a lot about what happened in the past. So spending a bit of time on that as well. In terms of the Grey Cup, there's probably no way of avoiding it. So I'll answer the question. Right. Let me give you a bit of a story. I don't know whether it was the last time Calgary and Toronto met, but I know they met in 1971 for a very big game. In fact, there's a TSN special on us, the greatest team that never won. The Toronto Argonauts, Leon McQuay fumbling the ball on the 11-yard line, I think it was. The reason I remember that so well is I think that was the only time I cried in front of the TV at a sports event. We had been waiting for 20 years, so obviously I was growing up in Toronto then. The Argonauts were my team. Now, and look, I still have a soft spot for them, but now the shoe's on the other foot. I now live in Calgary. I represent Calgary in the House of Commons, so I've got be on the side of my new hometown.
I think you just made news. Yeah. That's good.
But I'll be happy with either. Look, good thing about a Grey Cup. Good thing about a Grey Cup is that a Canadian team always wins.
There you go. And you might as well be speaking French right now, because Grey Cup, you know. I just have to say, as an aside on your like of hockey, you know, I'm a Canada-U.S. geek, and so for me today, interviewing you, from my point of view, it's got to be like when you went to Saskatoon and you got to interview Gordie Howe and Wayne Gretzky. That had to be
fun.
A great moment.
That was really fun.
So this I can relate. This is cool. Okay, we do have a few minutes left. I have a couple more questions, but you've been very gracious, and I do want to give people an opportunity if you've been thinking about questions. So I think Emma's got a hand held. I would just ask you to raise your hand and identify yourself. Jennifer Sloan.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister Harper. I'm Jennifer Sloan from Target Canada. Some in the room may know us better by Target. And I'm a proud...
En français, s'il vous plaît. Make up for me.
Yeah. And a proud CABC board member. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We've been hearing a lot about the fiscal cliff in the U.S. And in fact, on the weekend, I read one report, no lie, that some people think it's a tourist destination and want to go find it and take a photo.
Oh, God.
And then there's others, like I believe Warren Buffett said late last week, he doesn't think it's a cliff, he thinks it's a slope, and we have more time. Regardless, no doubt the government's looking at this. And I was just wondering what Canada needs to do, should do, is doing in order to prepare should the Americans go off that cliff, or hopefully they're able to retreat from the edge.
Well, look, the first thing I would say, obviously, whatever happens in the United States, especially something that could happen that would significantly slow the American economy, would be of great concern to us. That's notwithstanding all of our efforts to plan for the longer term and diversify our economy. The state of our major export market has been the single biggest driving factor in Canadian growth or slowness of growth over the past several years. So we're watching this with great interest. I'd say, you know, in fairness to U.S. policymakers, I think there are two difficult questions here that kind of get mixed up together, and they're both important. One is the concern about very sudden drops in government expenditure and increases in taxes on January 1st that could have a significant, it could be a significant negative shock to the American and therefore the global economy. The other is the need for the United States, whatever is done on January 1st, to have a credible fiscal plan over the midterm to deal with what I think is a pretty serious long-run fiscal situation. So I think those two issues often get mixed together. I will just repeat what our Finance Minister, Minister Flaherty, said just recently, that I do think there are solutions to the January 1st situation that surely, and a lot of common ground on what some aspects of that solution would look like. So I would think that surely, now that the election's over, reasonable people would come to those solutions and not wait for a crisis. You know, to the extent I hear some people talking about a bungee cord, I think that kind of talk is foolish. You can't, if you go over a cliff, you can't be sure what will happen next. Like we saw with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, how a single major event can trigger a series of events that it's very hard to pull back from. So I would hope, and I have every reason to believe that I know most of these people, that they should be able to come to some kind of agreement on what to do about January 1st. I also remain, you know, notwithstanding all the difficulties that the U.S. economy faces, and I don't want to minimize them, you know, I also remain of the view that this is still at its heart the most entrepreneurial, dynamic, developed economy in the world. And, you know, my sense is that if it could be given, any kind of stability for not just for the next 2 months, but for the next few years, that the energy of the business community in the United States is just looking for the opportunity to get growth going again. Maybe not in the kind of ways we saw 10 years ago, but certainly picking up from the kind of pace we've seen in the last couple of years. So, look, we just urge congressional figures and the president to get on with an immediate solution, but also think seriously about how this fiscal situation is going to get under control over the next several years.
Thank you, sir. Great answer. Great question. Let's go to this side of the room. Kelly Johnston.
Prime Minister, thank you very much for being here today, and I want to thank you on behalf of my company, Campbell Soup Company, for your tremendous leadership on the Beyond the Border initiative. We first met, I think, when the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership, was at its, shall we say, tail end. And I can tell you have learned a great deal from that process. It shows up in this new one. As a U.S. company, I'm eager to hear your thoughts on what we, as U.S. companies who have a tremendous amount of cross-border trade, highly integrated North American supply chains and marketplaces, what we can do to help advance the process going forward.
Great, thanks. That really is a great question, and I would say there are three things. The first thing is get together, Canadian-American business, and identify. Continue to help identify what the issues are. Second thing is then when you've identified those issues, engage with the people who are involved in the process, bring those issues to their attention, especially if you think you've got solutions, try and push them up on the agenda. The third thing you can do and you can help us with, and this is where I think the process will succeed or fail in the long term. And that is, what can we do systemically to get around this kind of problem in the future? As I've said to President Obama and others, there's all kinds of things we can do now to identify all kinds of impediments to trades, kind of low-grade, silly impediments to trade or regulatory mismatches that don't make a lot of sense. But we'll be kind of fighting an uphill battle if, as soon as we solve them, elements of our system on each side of the border are generating new ones just as quick as we solve the old ones. So I think that's the real challenge, and that's what I've challenged our own officials to do, is not just fix these problems, but let's, as we fix them, identify what it was in the system that caused them to arise in the first place, so that we can better prevent them in the future. Now, that's not to say there aren't going to be different standards or there aren't going to be different ways we do business, but we don't want things like that unless there are really good and solid reasons. Neither of us want it, and I know the President feels the same way. Neither of us want it, not simply because this is an impediment to our business people doing business on both sides of the border, but we are both in challenging fiscal situations. United States more so than Canada, but we also have, on a much smaller level, our own fiscal challenge. We don't need to be spending money on systems that nobody wants. I can't think of a more useless waste of taxpayers' money. We always talk in political office that politicians have all kinds of reasons for wanting to spend money. When you spend money in a way that nobody cheers, and that's not a good thing. So I know that the President, like myself, wants to identify a systemic solution to those kinds of problems. So anything you could do to help with that as well as we go forward would be appreciated.
Get right on that, Kelly. We have just a couple more minutes left. So I'm going to take the privilege of asking the last couple quick questions. And for this one, I want to read a quote. There's a Canadian author, William Maryscott, who says this, quote, "Americans, whatever their flaws, are creators of the world's most vital mythology. Canadians are seasoned aficionados of everything USA. You can mimic it, you can break it down, you can infiltrate it. By age 13, the average Canadian has a doctorate-level degree of grasp of American pop culture. I think he's saying that Hollywood has a gigantic impact on how people view themselves in the world. I want to ask you a serious question about Canadian identity and the North. You've taken a particular interest. But I also want to ask you a couple of other less serious questions, like, have you seen Argo? And what do you think of it? And then I'll have one more at the end.
On the second one, Argo, it's a great movie.
It's a great movie.
I recommend everybody to see
Me
it.
too.
It's great.
It's going to do. Gary Dewar and I believe that it's going to do more for Canada-U.S. relations in the United States by helping Americans appreciate the fantastic heroism.
I know that Gary wanted to work himself into the plot of the I told him it just couldn't be done. It was.
That's true.
Yeah.
He did have a party with Ben Affleck and Ken Taylor at the embassy. It was pretty great.
What was the other question?
The other one we were just thinking about, and enough about Gary Dewar. Let's talk about, Gordon Giffen. Canadian sense of self and the North as part of it. You've taken a particular interest. You go there a lot, and it's part of the Canadian identity that Americans don't understand. And just kind of what draws you up there, and just kind of your views about it. I know it's a soft, fluffy question.
Well, look, a couple things. Canada's a northern nation. That is what one of the things that makes us distinct. Certainly, very distinct from the United States. And I always say, whereas in Canada, whereas in the United States, you say go west, young man, to kind of find your identity. I think in this country, historically, it's always been go north, and that really is the part of the country that defines our identity and has so much promise in terms of its abundant resources. But look, let me say this. I do want to say this. One of the things we've tried to do as a government, and I think with some success, obviously I think the economic circumstances have helped, is that we've come to office, our party's come to office with two views that too often in the past were seen, for reasons that escape me, as incompatible. One is that this government is extremely pro-American. We value the relationship with the United States. We are, as I say, we couldn't be in a better situation than to have the United States as our only real neighbor, our closest economic partner, and ultimately our ally and friend on everything in the world. At the same time, we are strong Canadian nationalists who value what is distinctive and unique about this country and think in our own modest way that this is actually a better country. And we see no incompatibility with that. And what we've tried to do and tried to tell Canadians is there is no need for true Canadian nationalism to have any sense of anti-Americanism. We're different, we're distinct, we're unique, we value that. I think there's lots of aspects, not just of Canadian policy, but of the Canadian character that have proven themselves to be quite strong and durable in the last 4 or 5 years because of what has happened in the global economy. But let's marry those two things. And we recognize the United States is a bigger and more powerful country. But that does not and should not be a basis of resentment. It should be a basis of our pride in the importance of the relationship that we share. That's this government's view. We've tried to project that view to Canadians, and I think Canadians are embracing that. I think Canadians can not only celebrate the North, Canadians can celebrate the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, which was ultimately about our independence from the United States, from an American attack, but in a way that is not anti-American, in a way that is celebrating our history, but at the same time recognizing the great and enduring relationship that has come out of that particular period of our history. So that's what we're trying to do in this country, and I do think Canadians are embracing that. And my only complaint about the United States, and every Canadian will say this, but it's just the way it is we always like to have more attention in the United States. We certainly pay a lot of attention to you. You sometimes don't pay enough of attention to us.
Dude, I'm here.
The squeaky, yeah.
How many Americans in the room? Who's with me?
The squeaky wheel gets the grease, they say, and we're not the squeaky wheel. But look, we recognize that the United States obligations and responsibilities are global, and to the extent we share values and interests, which is largely true, that we want to do what we can to be helpful in that world role.
So appreciated. We're just going to end on one thing, and it's we talked a little bit about American pop culture, and there's a picture of you from a trip to the UK. You walked into a Beatles song off Abbey Road, so I wonder if you can, I don't know if everybody here knows, I just think it's a cool story. I wonder if we can show the picture, and if you could explain what surprise you got for your 50th birthday from your wife and your team. Do we have the picture? There we go.
There we are. Yeah, the story was we were there, that was the second G20 after the one in Washington, right at the kind of the height of the crisis in November. And then Prime Minister Gordon Brown held the next G20 in April in London, and that was around the time of my birthday. And so when the conference was done, family said, "Oh, let's go out for a walk, and would you like to see where Abbey Road is?" I said, "Sure, let's go over to Abbey Road." So we went out there, we did this picture, and then the wife said, "We should go knock on the door and see if we could get a tour." I said, "Lorraine, I don't think you can go do that." And she said, "No, I think they're expecting you. We've arranged it all." So that's what I did. We went up, we knocked on the door, we went in, they gave us a great tour, including, I think it's Studio 2, where the Beatles recorded all of their stuff, and they brought out all these, as you know, I'm a piano player, they brought out all these pianos and keyboards that the Beatles actually composed a lot of this, or composed or performed a lot of this material on. And so I fooled around on that for, I don't know, it was probably 20 minutes or so. My disappointment was when I left, they then presented me with a CD. They had been recording what I was doing. And if I had known that, I would have tried to actually play something and do it well, but I was just fooling around.
So we have a parting gift for all of you on the way out. And on that note, please join me in thanking the Right Honorable Stephen Harper.